The outward curve. On this pattern, you're going to have a 1/2 inch of seam allowance on two of the edges and 1 inch on the other edge. This is a finished version of the sample. I'm going to show you that the use of notching has allowed the seam allowance to lay flat. You can see how if we hadn't removed that fabric that the seam allowance would be overlapping at this point. Let's get started. Now, since we need a 1/2 inch of seam allowance on both of these edges, I'm going to mark that on my fabric first using my ruler. And then I'm going to snug my pattern piece right up to those lines that I've just drawn. That way I don't have to cut on those edges. Trace our pattern, mark our notch. Now, to show you how to mark this 1 inch of seam allowance, I'm going to use a different tool. This is called a gauge. And I move the blue marker to the 1 inch point, and it will stay there. And then I can just move along knowing that as long as the blue marker is against my stitch line, that I will be marking an even 1 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to use my scissors to connect those lines instead of connecting that with a pencil. You can see how the blades of my scissors are connecting one dash to another. And as we need 2 pieces of this pattern, we're going to flip over our pattern piece and repeat this process. You're going to want to use parallel pins, as curves are always a little tricky. So this is how many pins you're going to want in this project. Nice parallel pinning. Let's start sewing. You're going to sew through the seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning of your stitch line. We're going to back stitch right here at the end of our seam and continue sewing through the seam allowance. Let's see how it looks. We hit our line good on this side and on the back side. Excellent. Now for ironing. As always, we're going to iron our stitches to relax them in the fabric. Then we are going to trim our seam allowance from 1 inch down to a 1/2 inch. So cut your seam allowance in half. Then we are going to grade our seam allowance, cutting the top seam allowance in half, down to 1/4 inch. This is the top seam allowance only. And now we are going to notch. So in order to get this project to turn right side out and lay flat, we have to notch our seam allowance. And the reason we need to remove bulk from our seam allowance is because of how this is going to lay when it's turned right side out. The seam allowance would overlap itself otherwise. Now we're going to cut to the stitch line, but not through the stitch line. But we are getting right up next to that stitch line. You have to, when you notch, cut all the way to your thread. Now another option for notching is to fold your fabric and cut a triangle such as pictured. You get a bigger triangle, so it's a little quicker, but it is easier to make mistakes and cut through your stitching that way. So I recommend, as you're getting used to this, to cut with your sample laying flat. Now at the tightest part of the curve, you're going to want to make notches every 1/4 of an inch. On the flatter parts of the curve, you can do notches every 1/2 inch or more. Now it is time to turn your sample right side out. Remember, you are in control of the fabric. And you're going to need to finger roll your fabric to the edges. Use steam to help with this process, but do not put the iron on the fabric. And you're just going to finger roll your fabric right up to that seam line. So there are no tacos, and you have a very crisp seam edge. This will take a little while, a little finagling. Now here I've noticed that my seam isn't laying as flat as it could, which means I need to go in and clip my seam allowance to get that spot to relax more. I'm going to clip right up to the stitching, turn it right side out, and there we go. Now it's nice and flat. And once you're satisfied with your seam, only then do you take the iron and put it directly on your sample using heat and steam. There is our beautiful outward curve.